The silver-handled serving spoon had been halfway to Mr. Gerald Pelham's mouth when the room went still. It was the 3rd day of November, in the year 1814, and the principal dining room of Pelham Hall had been laid for 9. The candles were lit early, as they always were in autumn when the light failed before 4 o'clock, and their glow caught the underside of the old portrait above the mantel. The late Lord Reginald Pelham painted 30 years prior, watching the gathering below with an expression that had always struck Cecily Vane as quietly alert. 9 places, 9 chairs, 9 members of a family, assembled for the formal reading of a dead man's testament, and at the far end of the table, positioned between the second footman's station and the window that looked onto the kitchen garden, sat Cecily herself. She was not family. She was the late lord's former governess, retained a fortnight past the funeral, at the request of no one in particular, and given a seat at the lower end of the table because no one had thought to tell her to leave. Forsyth, the solicitor, had begun reading 40 minutes ago. His voice was dry and thin and correct, and he had been reading from a document whose seal Cecily recognized because she had seen it before. She had seen the earlier one, the one dated March of 1812. She had seen it in Lord Pelham's own hands. On the afternoon he had told her he intended to have it superseded. She had not meant to speak. She had meant to wait, to say nothing, to allow the reading to conclude, and then to approach Mr. Forsyth privately. She had told herself this every morning for 4 days, and she might have kept to it, had Mr. Forsyth not cleared his throat at the passage regarding the disposition of the Pelham Hall estate and surrounding lands, and begun to read a distribution that Cecily knew with absolute certainty Lord Reginald Pelham had not wished. "I know where the real will is," she said. She had not raised her voice. She had not stood. She had simply set down her water-glass and spoken, and the words dropped into the room like a key into a lock. The spoon stopped. Gerald Pelham's hand held it suspended a few inches from his mouth, and the expression on his face moved through surprise toward something cooler and more calculating. Lady Maud Pelham, seated at the table's head, went very still. The other chairs, cousins and a solicitor's clerk, and the aged Sir Humphrey Dunning, who had come down from Lincolnshire for the occasion, produced a silence so complete that Cecily could hear the fire settle in the grate. Edmund Hartwood, Viscount Hartwood, was seated to Lady Maud's right, and he did not move at all. He had not moved much since his arrival 3 days prior. He held himself with the economy of a man accustomed to concealing what he felt, and his dark gray eyes had come to rest on Cecily with an attention so level it was difficult to read. She did not look at him. She looked at Mr. Forsyth, and she waited. If there is something to be said for the silence that follows a thing like that, it is only this. It tells you everything about a room that the conversation before it carefully hid. Her father had been Thomas Vane. That was where it began, or where it might most usefully begin, because the story of how Cecily came to sit at the lower end of a dead baron's dining table with a secret she could not afford to keep was also the story of what had been done to the man who raised her. Thomas Vane had served Lord Reginald Pelham for 22 years as his private secretary, and those years had been the whole of Cecily's childhood. She had grown up at the edge of the Pelham estate, the way a child grows up at the edge of a river, aware that the current was not hers but intimate with its particular quality of light. Her father had been a careful man, methodical and loyal, who wrote a clean hand and kept every figure in his ledgers twice, the second time so that any error in the first might be caught. Lord Pelham had trusted him without reservation, and Thomas Vane had given him no reason to do otherwise, until Lady Maud Pelham decided that he had. Lady Maud was the widow of Lord Pelham's elder brother, who had died in 1803, and in the 11 years since that death, she had made herself indispensable to Pelham Hall in the way that a stone laid across a garden gate makes itself indispensable. Nothing grew easily in its shadow, and nothing passes through without her notice. She had wanted her son Gerald installed as Lord Pelham's steward, and Thomas Vane's presence in the position he occupied made that impossible. The accusation of misappropriated funds had been put forward 18 months before Lord Pelham's own death, and it was crafted with enough precision to be credible, and enough vagueness to be impossible to disprove cleanly. Thomas Vane was dismissed in February of 1813. He died the following September, of a consumption that Cecily believed had been waiting for precisely such a blow to make its final claim. He left her £47, a small silver brooch that had been her mother's, and a name that the people of this county would not say, without lowering their voices. She had come to Pelham Hall 6 months before Lord Reginald's death. Not because there was nowhere else to go. There were other positions. She had other skills. She came because Lord Pelham had written to her himself. The letter was short and in his own hand. He was sorry for what had been done to her father. He wished to make what amendment he could, and in the meantime he had need of a governess for the younger children of his niece, who were visiting for an extended stay. He could not restore her father's name publicly. Not yet, but she would find the household had a longer memory than its current arrangement suggested. She had come, and in the 3rd week of October, 6 days before he died, Lord Reginald Pelham had asked her to attend him in his private study. There was another man in the room she did not recognize, a Mr. Whitmore, introduced to her as a solicitor from Shrewsbury. Lord Pelham sat at his writing desk in his dressing gown, which frightened her more than the pallor of his face, because he had always been precise about his dress in the presence of others. There was a document on the desk, already signed and sealed by Mr. Whitmore. Lord Pelham held it for a moment, then placed it in a small cedar chest that lived beneath the window seat of his study. He locked the chest with a brass key on a length of gray ribbon and turned to Cecily. "I am told I may not have long," he said, "and there are those in this house who would find this document before it could be properly invoked, if they knew where it lived." He placed the key in her hand and closed her fingers around it. "Keep it safe, child. When the time comes, you will know what to do with it." She had kept it. She was keeping it now in the pocket of her sage green gown, its weight so familiar over the past 3 weeks that she had ceased to feel it as anything other than part of herself. She had not anticipated that the time would come in the form of Mr. Forsyth reading from a document that she recognized as the old one. The morning after the silence, Gerald Pelham found her in the corridor near the schoolroom and offered her £200. He was pleasant about it. Gerald Pelham was frequently pleasant, in the way that a calculation might be pleasant, efficient, and smooth and finished the moment it had served its purpose. He said that he understood she had been fond of his uncle, that he appreciated her loyalty, that whatever she believed she might have witnessed was likely a confusion of memory. The late lord had been unwell for some time. The elderly became sentimental, and sometimes spoke of things they intended without completing them. £200 was a generous sum. It would allow her to establish herself comfortably in a new position, far from the county, where these unfortunate misunderstandings would not follow her. She said, "No, thank you, Mr. Pelham," and turned back toward the schoolroom. She had not known then that Edmund was standing in the corridor shadow near the alcove at the far end, and had heard every word. She only learned this later, from Mrs. Agnes Holt, the housekeeper, who had been passing through the corridor behind her, and had seen the Viscount's face in. The moment after Cecily's refusal, Mrs. Holt said only that Lord Hardwood had watched Miss Vane walk away, with an expression she could not name but intended to remember what Cecily had felt in the corridor, in the moment of the refusal itself, was less courage than clarity. She had been afraid, and the fear had still been entirely present when she opened her mouth, so perhaps it was not courage at all, but simply the recognition that the alternative was worse. £200 was not nothing. It was nearly 5 times what she had saved in the whole of her working life, and it would have purchased a future that asked nothing more of her than silence, which was, she had noticed, the commodity most consistently valued in women of her station. She had stood in the corridor holding the number in her mind for the space of 2 breaths, and then she had said no, and the clarity she felt afterward was not triumph. It was more like setting down something very heavy, and finding that her hands still worked. She did not allow herself to think about what came next. The key was in her pocket. That was enough for the moment. That afternoon, Edmund came to the small sitting room where Cecily had retreated with a French grammar and a cup of tea that had gone cold. He did not announce himself. He stood in the doorway for a moment, and then he said, "Come into the library. The fire is better. There." It was not an invitation. shaped as a question. It was not quite a command. It was something in between. And Cecily, who had been telling herself for 3 days that she was managing this situation without assistance, found herself rising from her chair and following him before she had consciously decided to do so. The library at Pelham Hall was a long room with shelves to the ceiling and 2 deep windows that looked onto the kitchen garden. The fire was indeed better. Edmund stood beside it, one hand resting on the mantel, his dark navy tailcoat very still, and he looked at her with the same level, measuring a tension she had begun to feel across rooms. "You refused Gerald's offer," he said. "Not a question." "I did, my lord. He will not offer again. He will move to have you removed from the property. I am aware of that possibility." He was quiet for a moment. The fire settled. She was acutely conscious of the distance between them, and then of the fact that she was conscious of it, and of the warmth that climbed her throat for no reason she could attribute to the hearth. "What you claim to have witnessed," he said slowly, "is not a small thing to put before a room." "No," she said, "it is not." He looked at her then for several seconds without speaking. The fire was at his back, and the window behind her, and the late afternoon light was the gray of November at 4 o'clock, and it made the room a kind of interval, separate from the house's ordinary business. She was aware of the bookshelf nearest her right shoulder, the title on its spine too dim to read. She was aware of the precise distance between where she stood and where he stood, which was perhaps 8 feet, and felt at once too much, and not quite manageable. She was aware of her own breathing, which she was working to keep even, and of the brass key in her pocket, pressing against the side of her hand. She had been in rooms with men of rank and authority before, in the course of her father's work, and she had learned early that the thing to do was to be as still as furniture and as forgettable as wallpaper. She had cultivated invisibility, the way some women cultivated accomplishments, as a survival skill, and it had mostly served her. Lord Hartwood did not look at her as though she were wallpaper. He looked at her as though she were a document he was reading very carefully, and the experience was unsettling in a way she could not entirely account for by his rank. If you are wrong, or if the document cannot be produced, you will have made enemies you cannot afford. He paused. You will have made enemies you cannot afford in either case. She met his eyes. They were darker than they appeared from across a dinner table, and the scar through his left brow caught the firelight in a way that made her think of old maps, of a country that had been changed by something it had survived. "I am not wrong," she said, "and I know precisely where it is." He looked at her for a long moment. Then he said, "Sit down, there is tea on the table." She sat. He did not. He remained standing by the fire, and it was another minute before he spoke again, and when he did, his voice had changed. By some degree she could not measure. It was lower and it had lost some of its procedural caution. "My father," he said, "retained a solicitor named Coates, who proved to be of the same family of men as your Mr. Forsyth." He paused. He seemed quite legitimate. He came with references from 2 members of the Lords. He was methodical, correct, and entirely careful about the appearance of his conduct. By the time my father understood what had been arranged in his name, the estate's northern holdings were already compromised. He did not look at her while he said this. He looked at the fire. "There was a woman," he said after another silence. That was not empty. It was the silence of a man setting something down very carefully. "Miss Clara Wren." She had been in residence with her aunt at the adjacent property. I had spoken to her father. There were arrangements being made. He stopped. I was away for 4 months, dealing with Coates and the aftermath. When I returned, she had died of a fever the previous January. Her aunt told me she had been ill since November. No one had sent for the physician from the next county, because no one in the household had the authority to authorize the expense, and her father was traveling, and could not be reached. He paused again. I had been the person who would have authorized it. Cecily did not speak. She understood that she was not meant to speak. Not yet. She understood that he was telling her something that he told no one, and that the telling of it was the most costly thing he had done in some time. "I waited too long," he said. "I deferred to the process. I told myself there was a correct order to things, that the correct order would produce the correct result. He turned from the fire then and looked at her directly. It did not. The brass key was warm in her pocket. She was aware of its weight with the particular clarity of a thing that has been carried a long time and is almost ready to be put down. "My lord," she said quietly, "I do not intend to wait." He looked at her for a moment that lasted several beats past comfortable. Then he said, with something at the edge of his voice that she could not yet name, "No, I did not think you did." The formal sitting room on the following morning had been arranged to Lady Maud's specifications, with chairs positioned in a formal semicircle, Mr. Mistra. Forsyth at a small writing table with the disputed document before him, Gerald standing beside his mother with the careful ease of a man who has been told to look comfortable. A fire burned in the grate. The remaining members of the family had assembled at the appointed hour, and Sir Humphrey Dunning, who was the eldest peer present, and had known Lord Pelham for 40 years, sat near the window with his hands on his cane. Cecily was present because no one had explicitly told her not to be, and because she had decided that she was done with waiting to be told. Lady Maud had not looked at her when she entered. Gerald had. His glance was brief and dismissive, and it contained a calculation that did not quite resolve into concern. Mr. Forsyth began by restating the legitimacy of the document in his hands. It had been drafted, he said, in full accordance with Lord Pelham's wishes, as expressed to himself the sole solicitor of record for the Pelham estate. It bore the correct seals. It had been witnessed by 2 members of the household staff, whose names he gave. He intended to complete the reading that had been interrupted at dinner the previous evening, and he trusted the assembled family would have no further disruptions. He looked at Cecily when he said the word disruptions. "She fancies herself something important," Gerald said to the room at large in the tone one uses for a minor inconvenience. "The little governess. She has been occupying herself with her father's old grudges, I suspect, dressed up as something more." Edmund was in the room. He had come in behind Cecily and taken a position near the door, his back against the wall and his arms loose at his sides. He said nothing. Cecily said, "The document Mr. Forsyth holds was executed in March of 1812. Lord Pelham subsequently determined and communicated to me directly that he wished to alter the disposition of the primary estate and several matters of personal bequest. A new will was drawn in October of this year by a Mr. Dacian, Whitmore of Shrewsbury, in the presence of myself and 2 witnesses, and placed in a cedar chest in Lord Pelham's private study, secured with a brass key that Lord Pelham gave to me personally." She paused. "I have that key in my possession." The silence was of a different quality than the one at dinner. That one had been surprised. This one was afraid. Mr. Forsyth recovered first. He said, with the smooth authority of a man whose procedure had never been interrupted before, and who had decided it would not be interrupted now, that any such document could not be considered valid without proper authentication, that the estate's solicitor of record was the appropriate authority to assess any secondary claim, and that until and unless such authentication could be provided through the correct channels, it would be inappropriate to halt the established process. "The correct channels," Gerald said with a thin smile. "Precisely." He looked at Cecily. "The correct channels are not a governess producing a key from her pocket and telling ghost stories about private meetings with a dying man." Lady Maud said without looking up from her hands in her lap. "She was always peculiar. Her father was peculiar. The little governess comes by it honestly enough." Forsyth agreed that any secondary document would need to be assessed in the fullness of time, through appropriate legal procedure, and that to do otherwise would be to invite chaos into the administration of a great estate. He said this with such firm reasonableness that 2 of the cousins nodded. He said it with such quiet certainty that Cecily felt for one terrible moment the specific gravity of being correct and dismissed simultaneously, the way her father must have felt it, the way she had spent most of her adult life, being trained to be afraid of feeling it. Forsyth added, for the benefit of the room, that it was regrettable when the grief of bereavement produced in those adjacent to the deceased a kind of attachment to certain wishes they believed they had perceived, wishes which the legal instrument, whatever one thought of it personally, must ultimately supersede. He did not look at Cecily when he said this. He looked at the middle distance above her head. In the specific manner of a man who is performing magnanimity, he called her, once, the little governess. The phrase landed in the room as Gerald had not quite managed to, because Forsyth said it without heat, as a classification rather than an insult, as though she were a variety of household complication one encountered from time to time, and managed by applying the appropriate procedure. One of the cousins, a Mrs. Hartley with a face like a closed purse, leaned toward her neighbor and whispered something behind her fan. Whatever it was, it produced a small, dry sound that was not quite a laugh. She was afraid. Her hand in her pocket had closed around the key all the same. And she did not move. Then Edmund pushed himself away from the wall. He did it without urgency. He crossed the room in the unhurried manner of a man who has decided something so completely that the deciding is already behind him. He did not look at Gerald, or at Lady Maud, or at Mr. Forsyth. He stopped beside Cecily, turned to face the room, and said, "I stand with Miss Vane. Produce the chest." 9 words. They were not loud. They were the kind of sentence that, once said, sits in the air of a room like an alteration in the weather. Mr. Forsyth opened his mouth. "The chest," Edmund said again, equally quiet, equally irrevocable. Gerald's face had gone through several arrangements, none of them comfortable. He said, "Hartwood, this is unnecessary. The matter is procedurally settled. To entertain the fantasy of a dismissed servant's daughter is beneath the dignity of everyone in this room. Then it will take very little time to demonstrate that she is wrong," Edmund said. He looked at Forsyth. "Send for Mrs. Holt. She knows where the study's effects are stored." "Lady Maud," said Edmund. Her voice carried the specific tone of a woman who has been employing that tone for 30 years and has never yet had it fail her. "You are being influenced by a young woman who has an interest in unsettling this process. Sentiment is understandable. It is not, however, a legal instrument." Edmund looked at her then, steadily and without hostility, and with a quality in his face that Cecily would spend a long time afterward trying to describe. It was not coldness. It was the opposite of coldness. It was the look of a man who had for some years been standing at a remove from his own life, and who had stepped back into it. "Send for Mrs. Holt," he said. "Mrs. Barr." "Mrs. Holt," he said. Agnes Holt had been housekeeper at Pelham Hall for 19 years, and she walked into the sitting room with the settled bearing of a woman who has been expecting to be called and has had time to consider exactly what she means to say. She was gray-haired and broad-shouldered, and she looked at the assembled family with the same composed attention she brought to the inspection of linen. She confirmed to the room that she had been present in Lord Pelham's study in October of that year, along with a Mr. Whitmore and Miss Vane. She confirmed that a document had been signed and sealed and placed in a cedar chest beneath the study window seat. She confirmed that she had been asked to say nothing of this until the appropriate moment, which she judged to be now. The cedar chest was brought down from the study by 2 footmen, at Edmund's direction. It was unlocked with Cecily's brass key. The document inside bore Mr. Permeter, Whitmore's seal and Lord Pelham's signature and the signatures of Agnes Holt and a parlour-maid named Ruth Colby, who was summoned from the kitchen, and who confirmed, with her hands shaking and her voice steady, that she had signed her name to a paper in Lord Pelham's study 6 weeks prior, and knew exactly what she had witnessed. Sir Humphrey Dunning read the document through twice, in silence, his lips moving slightly. Then he set it down on his knees and looked at the room over the top of his spectacles. He said that the document appeared to be in order and predated no contradicting instrument he was aware of, and that it was his opinion, as the senior peer present, that the contents were to be treated as authoritative pending any formal probate proceeding, which he had every confidence would confirm them. The principal beneficiary named in the will was Edmund Hartwood, Viscount Hartwood, to whom Lord Pelham had bequeathed Pelham Hall, its lands and effects, and a letter of private instruction to be opened separately. There were further provisions: a sum of money to Mrs. Holt, a set of specific bequests to various members of the household, and a brief paragraph addressed to the matter of Miss Cecily Vane, whose father had been wrongly dismissed, whose name Lord Pelham wished it known, he considered himself to have dishonored, and to whom he bequeathed the writing desk from his private study, the contents of which included every letter her father had ever written him, every ledger entry in Thomas Vane's clean, doubled hand, and a separate document in which Lord Pelham set out, in his own words, a full account of what Lady Maud Pelham had done, and why Thomas Vane had been dismissed without cause. The room was very quiet for some time after Sir Humphrey finished reading. Gerald Pelham sat down, not dramatically. He simply, at a certain point, required a chair. Lady Maud's hands were still in her lap. She did not speak, and that was perhaps the most marked silence in the room, because she had been speaking, at various registers and with great confidence, for 30 years. When she finally looked up, she looked not at her son or at Mr. Patter, Forsyth, or at the document in Sir Humphrey's hands. She looked at Cecily, and in that look there was something that, if it was not recognition, was at least adjacent to it. The awareness that she had been wrong. Not wrong in the way that accidents are wrong, but wrong in the way that choosing to see only what one needs to see is wrong, which is to say, deliberately. The cousins did not speak either, for a moment. Then Mrs. Hartley, with the closed purse face, set down her teacup, and the small sound it made was the first ordinary noise the room had produced in 10 minutes, and it seemed to release something. People shifted in their chairs. Someone near the window cleared his throat. Sir Humphrey pressed the document once more, smoothing it along the fold, and said that he would write to the appropriate chambers that afternoon. The matter was not ceremonially concluded, he added, but the path forward was clear, and he trusted all present understood their obligations under the law. He did not look at Forsyth when he said it, but Forsyth looked at the middle distance for a long moment after, and Cecily watched something move across his face that was not quite shame, and was not quite calculation, and was somewhere between the two. The parlour-maid, Ruth Colby, had been brought back to the servants' hall by the time the room finally began to dissolve. Cecily thought of her as she watched the cousins find their hats and make their various exits. The small act of ordinary courage it had taken for that young woman to stand in a room full of family and name what she had witnessed. She did not know if there was a word for it that the period recognized. She thought her father would have had one. Forsyth gathered his papers with great method and said nothing that could be later quoted. Edmund offered his arm to Cecily and walked her to the corridor. In the corridor, she stopped. She had been keeping her breath very controlled for some time, and now she was not certain she could continue to do so. Her hand was still closed around the key. "Miss Vane," he said. Then he said more quietly, "Cecily." It was the first time he had used her given name, and he said it, the way one says a word one has been practicing in private, carefully enough that the practice does not show. She looked up at him. The scar through his left brow was very close. The compressed line of his mouth had opened slightly, as though some pressure that had been holding it had been released. "Your father," he said, "was not the only one who waited too long for justice he deserved." She did not know what to say, so she said the thing that was true. He would have been glad someone finally looked. He looked at her for a long moment with those dark gray eyes, and the corridor was very still, and the warm air from the sitting room drifted past them both. "Walk with me," he said. "There is a garden on the east side that I am told is reasonable at this hour." She went. The garden at that hour was cold and still, the kitchen plot visible beyond the low wall and the beds along the south-facing border stripped down to their winter canes. The sky was the pale, washed gray of late November, and the air smelled of damp stone and the very distant suggestion of snow. They walked the length of the garden without speaking, and the silence was not uncomfortable. It was the silence of two people who have recently been through something and are discovering that the space between them, now that the crisis has resolved, is not empty but full of something that has not yet been named. At the far end of the garden, there was a stone bench she had sat on once. In October, on a morning when the light was different and she had not yet understood what she was carrying. She did not sit on it now. They turned and walked back the way they had come, and the house rose before them with its lit windows, and she thought of her father's clean hand and the ledgers in the letter tied with string, and she felt, for the first time in a long time, that the future was a country she might be permitted to enter. She went inside. The writing desk arrived in her room that evening, carried by the same 2 footmen who had brought down the cedar chest, and it was heavier than she expected, and she had to ask them to set it near the window rather than against the far wall because the light was better there. The wooden box came with it. The footmen were careful with it, and they did not look at her directly, but neither did they look at her the way people in the household had been looking at her for the past 3 days, which was to say, as though she were an untidy situation that would shortly be cleared away. One of them, a young man with red hair and an accent from the North Country, set the box down on the desk and said, quietly, that he had known her father just slightly, that Mr. Vane had once helped him write a letter to his mother that he had not known how to begin, and that he was glad about today. She thanked him. He nodded and went. She sat with the box for a long time before she opened it. The string around the letters was the same string her father had always used, a particular shade of brown, bought at the same shop in Shrewsbury for as long as she could remember. The ledgers were in his hand, the columns straight and doubled, as they always had been. She read Lord Pelham's account of what Lady Maud had done twice through before she allowed herself to cry, and she cried quietly and for a long time, and then washed her face and sat at the desk and found a piece of paper and a pen. She was not yet certain what she wished to write. She sat with her hands in her lap for several minutes, and then she opened the desk's central drawer, looking for a suitable nib, and found instead a folded letter, addressed in Lord Pelham's handwriting, to Viscount Hartwood, which had been there all along. She set it carefully on the desk surface, and did not open it. It was not hers to open. There was a knock at the door some time later, not the brisk knock of a servant, but the quieter, more uncertain knock of someone who is not accustomed to standing in corridors and is doing so anyway. She said, "Come in," and Edmund came in, and looked at the letter on the desk, and said, "He told you it was there." "He did not," she said. "I found it by accident." He stood looking at it for a moment. Then he picked it up, and stood by the window to read it, in the last of the evening light, and Cecily turned back to her own blank page, and left him to it. She did not know how much time passed. The fire settled twice. The light at the window went gray, and then darker, and then the room existed entirely by candlelight. She heard him fold the letter. She heard, after a silence, the sound of him sitting down in the room's second chair, the one near the hearth. She was still at the desk. They were perhaps 8 feet apart. "He says in it," Edmund said after a moment, "that he knew from the first week you arrived here that you were your father's daughter. He says that is the highest compliment he can pay." She said nothing. "He also says," Edmund went on with a quality in his voice she had not heard before, a slight roughness at the edges, "that he hopes I will have the sense to see what is directly in front of me, which he confesses is a hope he held less than perfectly grounded, given what he observed of me at dinner for 4 years. She turned to look at him then. He was sitting in the chair with the letter in his hands, and the firelight on the scar through his left brow, and he looked, for perhaps the first time since she had met him, neither controlled nor deliberate. He looked like a man who has come to the end of a very long calculation, and found that the answer is something warmer than he had prepared for. "I am aware," he said, "that this is not the moment, that there is a great deal still to be managed, legally and practically, and that it would be presumptuous to speak before any of it is arranged." He paused. "I am telling you this because I have recently had occasion to revise my position on the wisdom of waiting until the correct moment arrives." She had kept the key in her pocket for 3 weeks. She took it out now and set it on the desk between them, small and brass and warm from her hand. "The correct moment," she said, "is generally the one in which one acts." He looked at the key. He looked at her. The slight roughness in his voice was still there when he said, "Then let me say that I intend to speak to you properly, and at length, once the estate is settled and your father's name is restored in writing to the record. It never should have left." He paused. "And that, until that time, I would be grateful." if you would stay outside the window. The first few flakes of November snow had begun to fall on the east garden, very quiet and very white against the dark. Inside, the fire was steady. The brass key sat on the desk between them, its ribbon curled beneath it, no longer needed for any lock. She looked at it for a moment, and then she looked at him, and she said, "Yes, my lord." And she called him Edmund before the week was out, and he called her Cecily in the library and in the garden, and once quietly, in the corridor where she had told Gerald Pelham. No, where the winter light came through the alcove window and lay flat and clear on the floor between them. The estate solicitor from Shrewsbury came and went. Sir Humphrey wrote to the appropriate parties, and the appropriate parties confirmed what he had said. The ledgers in Thomas Vane's clean hand were added to the formal record of the Pelham estate, and a letter of apology was drafted in Lady Maud Pelham's own writing, at the specific request of her own conscience and the firmness of Sir Humphrey's suggestion, and placed with the other documents in the house's files. Mrs. Agnes Holt kept her sum, and remained at Pelham Hall, because Pelham Hall needed a housekeeper who knew where things were, and could be trusted to say so. The brass key hung in a study on a small hook near the window, not because it opened anything anymore, but because Edmund put it there, and did not explain why, and Cecily understood. The writing desk stood in the room she had been given, and it remained there through the winter and the spring following, because by spring the room was hers in a more formal sense, and she was no longer at the lower end of any table, and her father's name was on the wall of the parish church in the list of the parish's faithful servants. Restored by Lord Pelham's own written instruction, carved in the same stone as everyone else. It was a small thing, it was everything. Thank you for staying until the very end. If Thomas Vane's long wait for justice, or the brass key that kept it, left something in your chest, leave a word below. There are more stories worth the telling, and the next one is already waiting. The key stayed on its hook. The snow outside the study window came and went, and came again, and a fire inside burned through it all. And Edmund read his correspondence at the desk where his predecessor had died and thought himself one of the more fortunate men in England, and was not wrong.